Okay, hi everyone. Welcome again to Author Story. I'm Alexander Lim, your host, and for this episode, I'm interviewing Julia Sloan, author of the book Learning to Think Strategically, which is already in its third edition. And for those of you following along who are interested, you can go over now to the Amazon link in the description below the video and check out or get a copy of her book. So, Julia, welcome to Author Story. Thanks for being our guest.
Oh, thank you, Alex. Thanks so much for inviting me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So, Julia, first off, tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your author story?
Well, my area of expertise is actually on the learning aspect of strategic thinking, and I'm on the faculty at Columbia University and at Central University of Finance and Economics in Beijing, and taught strategic thinking at the Brookings Institute as well. And I work with senior managers and senior leaders, CEOs and C-suite leaders on how to strengthen their strategic thinking.
Okay, so
And
yeah, go ahead.
I
Sorry.
I was going to say I live in New York City, but have actually spent most of my professional career working abroad in Asia and the Middle East and Africa, and I continue to work extensively outside of the U.S.
Wow. Okay, so I guess you've got like clients. I guess you'd call them clients worldwide. Hello, Julia. Hello, Julia. Do you hear me?
Yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah. So I take it then that you have clients worldwide.
Yes, yes, I do.
Okay, cool. And for how long have you been doing this work?
I've been working on the research for about 12 years and have worked for about 18 years in that field, in the field of strategic thinking.
Wow,
And
nice.
I work with corporate clients as well as mid-sized companies. And also I do a lot of work with international agencies and nonprofits as well.
Wow. So you've really got a big depth, a big database of knowledge then to draw from.
Well, it has, the whole learning aspect of strategic thinking has such broad application that and I'm so pleased about that because it applies to hospitals, to universities, to military, to businesses, corporations, startups, and that's one of the things I really take a lot of pleasure in is being able to work with a really diverse group of clients.
Wow, cool. Okay, got that. Cool. So about the book, would you mind telling us a little bit more about it and what it's all about? I know this is like the third edition of the book. I think the first edition came out like 2006 or something like that. What made you decide to write it?
I think what really spearheaded my research was really from my own experience, where I noticed that everybody was talking about strategy and strategic thinking and strategic planning and strategic implementation. And I noticed that people were really gobbling those words and using the words interchangeably. And that was only confusing anybody's ability to actually really strengthen or to develop their own strategic thinking because nobody really knew exactly what they were talking about. And I still feel that the term, over the past, I would say 5 or 6 years, the term has become a rather trendy term, but it tends to be overused, misused, and underdefined. And so I've really tried to cut through that and focus specifically on how it is that we learn strategic thinking. And so, one of the things that I do in the book, right up front in the first 4 chapters, is I differentiate strategic thinking from strategic planning. And one of the I make that differentiation based on the underlying cognitions that support strategic planning and support strategic thinking. And that is something that I is really quite different and unique in the body of strategy literature.
Okay. So what is the difference then between strategic thinking and strategic planning? Well, let's stick to strategic thinking first. What is strategic thinking?
Okay, well, I'll tell you, it's not at all what anybody thinks it is.
Yeah, okay, so what is it?
So, the differentiation that I make with strategic thinking is that it is the focus is on the problem rather than on the solution. And so, with strategic thinking, we really do tend to focus on the problem itself. And so, the purpose is really to suspend problem solving, to just put your finger on that pause button and stop looking for solutions, because what we tend to get rewarded for in business is very rapid response solutions. Just identify a problem, come up with a solution. So, what I have tried to do and work very, very hard with is before we move on to solution, let's make sure we put our finger on the pause button and say, do we have the real problem? And do we have the right problem? And the only way that we can really get at that is by going through this really rigorous process of what I call the 2 Ds of strategic thinking, which are divergent thinking and deep dive thinking.
Hmm.
And another difference, there's tons of stuff about strategic thinking that are different
Right.
from strategic planning.
Okay.
Another thing that is really different about it is strategic thinking is a very informal process. It's highly intuitive,
Mm-hmm.
very emotional. It's an informal process that's heavily reliant on what I call irrational thinking. So it's a very messy, informal process compared to strategic planning.
Right. And strategic planning then is more related, I guess, to finding the solution, implementing the solution. Is this correct?
Exactly. Perfect. Exactly. Strategic planning is what we're taught in business school. It's what we're taught in executive ed courses. It's what most of the strategy literature is on, um, using templates, models, recipes, formulas, um, where the focus is on coming up with a solution. And it's a very strategic planning is a very linear, logical, rational, convergent, analytical process, and it tends to be a formalized process, metrics driven. It's a very structured process. So the two couldn't be more different from each other, and I find once people make that differentiation and distinction, and they realize that the types of thinking that underlie each cluster are so different, people do very, very well in terms of developing and strengthening their own strategic thinking and that of their teams and companies.
Oh, nice. Okay. Now, you mentioned there's a certain kind of learning associated with strategic thinking. What sort of learning are we talking about here? I mean, you did mention that the linear kind of stuff that's taught in like business schools, it does not apply to strategic thinking.
Correct. For strategic thinking, I in the book, um, in the first 4 chapters, I kind of go through this in a great deal of detail. For strategic thinking, the underlying cognitive cluster, this chunk of thinking that is all kind of stuck together and they kind of support each other, are, for example, divergent thinking, which has a strong element of creative thinking to it. Critical reflective processes, which is kind of a garbled word, but the critical reflective processes plays a big role, and that's things like critical inquiry, not just asking questions, but really asking questions that identify underlying assumptions, underlying beliefs, and really hit at the premise of an issue. So that's very, very emotional because people are not aware of it. It's largely invisible. And we need other people to, what I call, poke holes in our thinking to be able to get to that. So the critical reflective processes that are necessary for strategic thinking are critical inquiry, critical dialogue, critical reflection.
Hmm.
Those are things that are, for the most part, not taught very well or very thoroughly in formal business environments,
Right?
but divergent thinking, creative thinking, conceptual thinking is another thing that is almost escaped us in terms of formal learning, but it's so necessary for strategic thinking to be able to see the problem in what I call panoramic view.
Mhm.
Um, it's a very nonlinear, it requires nonlinear thinking, highly intuitive. Um, Metaphoric thinking plays a big role in this, and polarity thinking. So those are some of the key kinds of thinking that support our ability to actually learn to think strategically.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. So Julia, this is all this thinking. It's it's very interesting, but a lot of people might not get a handle on what this kind of thinking is about. Can you give us an example of a case study where this kind of thinking was used and which opened up a new kind of like a new strategy, a new way for the client that or the person who thought about it?
Sure, absolutely. I offer several of these in the book, and actually a really recent example of working with a client. This was with a medical technology company. They had just spent about $3 million on strategic planning. They had contracted through a consultancy firm and had a really fantastic strategic plan, very detailed, and it was really excellent. But as we were starting to go through strategic thinking, what strategic thinking is, why it's important, these different types of exercises, the members from the C-suite just stood up during break and they said, we have a major corporate problem here. We have this fantastic new plan, but we have not done any strategic thinking. And so what they did was actually call for about a 4-month halt
Okay.
and really engaged in some really, really pulled all kinds of people into the critical conversations
Mhm.
and actually decided that they were going to close one plant,
Okay.
purchase another company, and open up a plant in another country as a result of engaging in strategic thinking.
Wow.
So it had a profound turnaround influence on that particular business.
Wow. Okay. And how's this business doing? I mean, compared to say if they had pushed through with their original strategic plan.
Well, I don't know that anybody knows what would have happened, because it never happened
Of
with
course.
the original plan. But certainly, as a result of engaging in strategic thinking and pulling people who would not ordinarily probably be attending strategy sessions, this it just completely turned around their business. They're actually doing very, very well,
Nice.
and they're ranked within the top 3 companies worldwide
Wow.
within their industry type. So they're doing very, very well. And I think a lot of this goes back to the fact that a lot of the things that we pay attention to in strategic planning actually don't fit into the framework of strategic thinking and vice versa. And we really need both. I'm certainly not throwing a bucket of cold water on strategic planning at all. We need strategic planning and we need good, well polished strategic planning. But it's simply not enough when we look at the complexity of the environment in which people are tasked with making strategy today.
Yeah.
We need to move well beyond the linear, logical, rational thinking, and we need to be able to tap into that irrational thinking domain.
Right. And I'm thinking particularly like nowadays with, businesses conducting business in countries all over the world. I'm sure globalization, strategic
Yeah.
thinking should play a part in that as well.
Oh, thank you so much for actually bringing this up and mentioning this. This is one of the reasons that I think strategic thinking has become uh, such a well recognized need within corporations is because of globalization. Um, many areas in the world place a much stronger reliance and a much stronger value on conceptual thinking, on critical reflective thinking, on divergent thinking, on the whole intuitive, irrational kind of thinking than what we do in North America.
Right.
And unless you know about these two buckets of thinking that support strategic thinking, what we tend to do is we compete with each other and we try to force and push people to think the same way we do. but yet we point the finger then in terms of blame, in terms of why aren't we getting an innovative strategy? Well, we can't get an innovative strategy by just using strategic planning.
Right. Yeah, because strategic thinking is definitely an entirely different animal.
Yeah, yes, totally.
Right. So this globalization, it kind of brings up another question I have, because you know culture is really overlooked where company strategies are concerned, and there are horror stories when it comes to
Yeah.
cultural cultures clashing. I mean, just one that I can think right off the top of my head is this American baby food company that sold baby food products in an African nation. They did not change their packaging when they showed a baby on the label. And the thing was, in that African nation, it's traditional to show on the packaging what the food is made of. So you can imagine why they didn't get many sales. So
Uh-huh.
on the cultural aspect, and I know you've dealt with people from all over the world, is strategic thinking culture dependent or is it culture independent? I mean, can you like teach anyone about strategic thinking?
Do you know this is like it's such a spot on question because I actually am constantly bombarded with one question from business leaders in every country, and they're constantly saying, why can't I find any good strategic thinkers here? And I get that question if I'm in China, I get the question if I'm in Indonesia,
Right?
if I'm in Brazil or Russia. Everybody points the finger of blame and says, why aren't there any strategic thinkers here? Well, actually, strategic thinking is learnable.
Okay.
Okay, it's actually learnable, and the process of learning strategic thinking is a human sort of a thing. It's universal. It's the same. It's kind of like a digestive system
Okay. Hello, Julia. Hello.
to pay attention to. Yes,
Yeah, sorry,
yes.
you cut out there
Are
for
you
a
able?
few seconds.
Oh,
Okay.
oh, okay. I was going to say. So, culture teaches us what we pay attention to, how we frame things, and how we identify patterns and how we make decisions. That's what we learn from culture. But the learning aspect of strategic thinking is actually human. So I find, of course, you have to pay attention to cultural dimensions. Hierarchy is probably one of the most important things to pay attention to. Um, but once we get past the specific culture traits that tend to influence the patterns and how we frame things and our decision making, then the learning process itself is the same. And so I find that's a huge relief. I find it's a big aha and a huge relief to people.
Hmm. Okay, cool. Interesting. So, we've covered that strategic thinking. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it occurs to me that still got a long way to go before it's common, how would I say, it's conversation, common knowledge is commonly used.
Yeah.
Is this correct?
I feel like that too. I feel like the term, in my experience, the term strategy, strategic thinking, strategic planning, strategic implementation, these terms have they tend to be used interchangeably. And I think it only confuses people when somebody says, um, I'd promote you, but I'd like to see you become more strategic in your thinking.
Right.
What exactly does that mean?
Exactly.
Uh, People don't know. Do you want me to become a better strategic planner,
Hmm.
which means sharpen my analytical thinking, my linear, logical, rational thinking? Or do you want me to really move into the divergent thinking and the deep dive aspect of strategic thinking? Or do you want me to just get out there and implement and just sell and produce? And so I find once people are able to differentiate these three, based on the underlying thinking that supports them, it just unfolds a whole new balloon full of knowledge for people.
Hmm. Right. Okay. So I'm sure you have I know how you call it, a vision of what the world would be like if strategic thinking were a commonplace conversation. What needs to be done for that vision to actually become a reality in your
Oh,
opinion?
that's a real tough question. But real tough question and a serious question. What I would really envision is that starting with primary school through junior high school, through university, through graduate school, right into corporate exec ed programs,
Hmm.
that people begin to value and to pay attention to things within that cognitive domain of irrational thinking, such as paying much more attention to really teaching and learning about intuition, about polarity thinking,
Hmm.
about the critical reflective processes, the use of metaphoric thinking.
Right.
I think things are, because they're not easily measured,
Yeah.
we tend not to teach them. So because they're not easily measured, they're not exactly convenient to teach.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying attention to them, because some of these things are so important for complex thinking. And I think we're doing a disservice to ourselves in the long run by avoiding or ignoring these sorts of cognitions within formal education. So that's kind of my, I guess, vision, if you will, and my hope for the future.
Okay, so what I'm getting here is strategic thinking. It is not just something that should be taught like in business school. This should be taught like from the beginning, from kids who are starting out and stuff like that.
Exactly, exactly. I think there's just paying attention to it gives value to it. And I think by the time somebody reaches, 21 years old or 40 years old, I'd love to see people appreciate and give value to some of these irrational types of thinking, because I think we pay a lot of attention to the cognitive cluster supporting strategic planning, which we should, but it's just simply not sufficient for dealing with complex issues.
Hmm. Right, right, okay. So, I'm just curious. I mean, if you, I don't know if you've thought about this, but how would like an introduction to strategic thinking look like for the, I don't know, the grade one, a first grade kid?
I think imagination, really tapping into that divergent,
Hmm.
tapping into that divergent um, cognitive set is just one of the places. Really paying attention to divergent thinking. Another thing that I think is so important is drawing,
Okay.
because getting young children, I use this with adults as well,
Mm.
getting them to draw their problem, because in drawing, when you draw, your irrational mind kicks in, your rational mind shuts down. And so you begin to see the problem so differently. The minute you take pen to paper and start to draw your problem, you begin to just completely expand your panorama of that particular problem. That supports divergent thinking, and it also supports and triggers that deep dive kind of thinking where we're able to uncover the assumptions and the very underlying premise. So these are things that can nicely be taught and easily be taught
Hmm.
in a primary school. There are things that can also nicely be taught in a graduate, in an MBA program.
Right. Okay, cool. So, right. So that's
They're just,
definitely.
they're so different. They're just so different than what the approach is that we're accustomed to using.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Right. Okay, so Julia, I mean, there are a lot of books out there in strategy and management. So, this question might be moot, given that the books are in its third edition. But what is it about learning to think strategically that makes someone think, I really should get this book rather than some other book on strategy and management?
Well, I think one of the key things is that this book really differentiates strategic thinking from strategic planning and strategic implementation based on the underlying cognitive clusters. And the focus is really on the learning aspect. How is it that we learn to think strategically?
Mm,
Not what is it that people do, but how is it that we learn? So I feel that once once people understand that the types of thinking that we use are just so different, people are able to actually help themselves and help their teams. I find once people go through the book and are able to kind of read through it and really think on it, people are able to really enhance their agility of thought. And I think that's something that is very useful for anybody who's trying to set strategy in such a complex environment.
interesting, interesting. Okay, cool. So, Julia, now a bit on a sidetrack. This book's still its third edition. What is there in this book that differs from previous editions? Why would someone who would own an earlier edition of this book want to buy this new edition?
This new edition has a triangle model that looks very simple on the surface, but is actually very complex underneath. And that's been something. That's actually one of the reasons that I wrote the third edition. Was there were so many queries about would you please include the triangle model that you use. So I have included a triangle model that I do use, and I've also included the two clusters of cognitions that support strategic thinking and strategic planning. And I think those are two reasons that I actually wrote the third edition, was people were really asking for that. Another thing is, for anybody who happens to be teaching at an MBA level or at a graduate level, the third edition includes a chunk of critical reflective questions that can be useful for either just thinking or for writing or triggering critical dialogue at the end of each chapter.
Right. Okay, okay. Interesting. Okay, got that. So, Julia, let's say you met up with this person, man or woman, doesn't matter, who's in a position to apply strategic thinking. Could be a manager, could be the head of a company, could be the head of a household. And you
Right.
had only enough time to tell this person one thing about strategic thinking and how it could best serve them. What would be that one thing you would tell that person, and why would you say it?
I would say this is going to sound off the wall, but truly what I would say is start to draw your problem.
Okay.
Start to draw your problem, because that will untap and unleash your irrational thinking, and you will begin to see the problem in a totally different light, in a much more expansive panorama than what you did if you relied only on your linear, logical, analytical thinking.
Okay, okay. Interesting. So good advice right there.
A little unconventional, but that's what I would advise.
Well, of course, yeah. So yeah, cool. Very interesting right there. Okay, so we're winding down now. So in closing, then the book is Learning to Think Strategically. It's in its third edition, so that should tell you listeners just how successful it is. The author is our guest, Julia Sloan, and you can find the book on Amazon. So Julia, wish we could talk some more, but we're winding down now. So thank you for your time. Thank you for being an author story. It was very insightful having you with us here today.
Oh, I thank you so much, Alec. This was a great pleasure.
You're welcome. So, if any of you listeners want to know more about this potentially, I know, very interesting topic, definitely, please feel free to go ahead and check out Learning to Think Strategically, which you can do so right now by going to the Amazon link in the description below the video. And if you'd like to follow our author interviews on YouTube, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. So, bye for now, everyone. I'll be back on Author Story next time with another inspiring author.